I was 13 when my parents walked out and never looked back. They told everyone I was staying with someone else, and the world believed them. 15 years later, they sat across from me in a quiet office, waiting to inherit a life they once abandoned, not knowing I was the only person who could decide whether they ever belonged in it again. My name is Elena Whitmore, and this is the story of how being left behind became the reason I never let anyone walk over me again. Chapter 1. The year I was left behind and no one looked back. I was 13 the year my parents said they would be gone for a few days and never came back. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday in 2013 in a quiet suburb of Illinois where nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen. Our street looked the same every day, with trimmed lawns and mailboxes leaning slightly to one side. That morning, my mother stood in the kitchen holding her phone, and my father checked his watch as if time itself were impatient with him. They told me they had to travel for work. Just a few days, maybe a week. They spoke in calm voices that sounded practiced and distant, like customer service calls that end before you can ask questions. There was no argument, no goodbye hug that lingered too long, no promise to call every night. My mother reminded me that there was food in the freezer, and my father said I was old enough to manage. 13 sounded old when adults said it. It felt very small once the door closed behind them. The first night, I ate a frozen meal and watched television until I fell asleep on the couch. I told myself they were probably tired from driving and would call in the morning. The second night, the house felt larger, too quiet. The clock in the kitchen ticked louder than it ever had before. I checked my phone more times than I could count. No missed calls, no messages. By the third evening, the food I liked was gone, and I started eating things I normally avoided. I told myself not to be dramatic. They said a few days, people travel all the time. I did not call again because I had already left 2 voicemails, and I did not want to sound needy. I had learned early that needing too much made people uncomfortable. At school, I pretended everything was normal. When the bell rang at the end of the day, I walked out with everyone else and stood near the pickup lane longer than I needed to. Cars came and went, parents waved, names were called. No one said mine. I waited until most of the other kids were gone before starting the walk home alone. Susan Miller noticed. She always did. She was my homeroom teacher and the kind of adult who remembered small things, like who hated group projects and who always forgot their lunch. That afternoon, she asked why I was walking again. I told her my parents were out of town for work. I said it quickly and with a smile so it would sound normal. She frowned just slightly and asked who I was staying with. I repeated what my parents had told the school office earlier that week, a family friend. It was true enough in the way lies often are when adults build them for you. Susan nodded. She did not press. I could see the question in her eyes and also the hesitation. The system knew something was off. The system also knew how to look away. That night, I counted the remaining food in the kitchen and tried to plan it out. I told myself if I could just stretch it a little longer, this would all be over. I slept in my clothes in case the phone rang and I had to answer quickly. It never did. By the 6th day, I stopped expecting the sound of the garage door. Hope is exhausting when it has nowhere to land. I started spending time at the public library after school because it was warm and quiet and no one asked why I was there. I sat between the shelves with my backpack at my feet and pretended to read while watching the front doors open and close. That was where Jonathan Hale found me. He was someone my parents had mentioned occasionally in the past, not often, usually with a tone that suggested distance and mild disapproval. He was a lawyer who worked in real estate before retiring, and he lived alone. He had known my family for years, but was never around holidays or birthdays. At 13, I barely remembered him. I recognized him because he looked at me like he was actually seeing me. He asked if my name was Elena, and I nodded. He did not start with questions about my parents or why I was there. He asked if I had eaten. When I hesitated, he nodded again, as if he had already guessed the answer. We went to a diner nearby. I ate slowly at first because part of me was waiting to be told I was taking too much. He did not watch my plate. He talked about ordinary things like the weather and traffic, and asked what subjects I liked in school. When I answered, he listened without interrupting. That alone felt unfamiliar. Afterward, he drove me to his house. It was not the kind of place people describe as impressive. It was clean, organized, quiet in a way that felt intentional rather than empty. The guest room had a neatly made bed and a small lamp on the nightstand. I sat on the edge of the mattress with my hands folded because I did not know what else to do. Jonathan stood in the doorway and told me I could stay there for now. He said he would take care of the calls and paperwork. He did not say how long now was or what would happen next. He did not promise me anything beyond that. He told me I could be there and that I did not need to earn the right to exist in his house. He said those words carefully and then left the room so I could sleep. That night, I stared at the ceiling and listened to a house that did not creak or echo. It did not feel like home. It felt like safety borrowed on a short-term basis. I told myself not to get comfortable. I told myself this was temporary too. In the days that followed, Jonathan made calls, some to lawyers, some to the school, some to people whose names I did not recognize. He never raised his voice. He never spoke badly about my parents in front of me. He simply handled things. At school, Susan Miller asked quietly if everything was okay now. I said yes because that seemed like the easiest answer, and because I did not know how to explain the truth, that things were better but also worse in a way I could not describe. Jonathan drove me to and from school. He asked how my day was and waited for the answer. When I talked, he did not rush me. When I didn't, he let the silence sit. One evening, I finally asked when my parents were coming back. He did not lie. He said he did not know and that he was working on making sure I would be okay regardless. He did not promise me anything beyond that. I learned quickly that he valued clarity over comfort. He set rules and explained them. Dinner was at 6, homework came before television, money was discussed openly and calmly. There was no sense that kindness could be withdrawn at any moment. That was new to me. Still, I kept my bag packed. I did not unpack my clothes into the dresser for weeks. I kept them folded and ready because part of me believed staying too long would make me a problem. Being easy had always felt like the safest way to survive. One night, as I stood in the hallway listening to the low hum of the refrigerator, I realized something had shifted. No one had told me to leave. No one had hinted that my presence was inconvenient. Jonathan treated my staying as a fact rather than a favor. That's when it occurred to me that this was not just a few days anymore. I wasn't sure what he was to me. I wasn't sure what I was allowed to hope for. But for the first time since my parents closed that door behind me, I felt something settle in my chest. Not relief, not happiness, just the sense that I was not completely untethered. I went to bed that night with my bag still packed, but my shoes placed neatly by the door instead of tucked into it. I told myself it didn't mean anything. I told myself not to read into it. Even then, I knew something had changed. I just did not yet trust it enough to say the words out loud.
Chapter 2. Being allowed to stay did not mean I belonged. The feeling did not disappear in the morning. It followed me quietly into the weeks that came after. Living with Jonathan settled into a pattern that felt temporary even as the calendar kept moving. I still thought in terms of days at first, then weeks, and then something more confusing that I did not have a word for. I woke up in the same room each morning, ate at the same small kitchen table, and rode to school in the same car. Nothing dramatic changed, which somehow made everything feel more fragile. Jonathan treated my presence as a fact rather than a favor, but I did not. I learned quickly how to move through the house without leaving a trace. I washed my cup immediately after using it. I turned lights off even if I planned to come back to the room. I folded blankets exactly the way I found them. It was not something he asked for, it was something I did because it felt safer to take up as little space as possible. The legal part of my life happened mostly in the background. Jonathan made calls from his office and spoke in a steady voice that never rose or dropped. Sometimes I heard the name Michael Reyes through the door. He explained once that Michael was a lawyer who was helping with paperwork so things would be clear and official. Clear and official sounded like words that belonged to other families, not mine. My parents did not object, they did not cooperate either. Their silence was complete and oddly efficient. It allowed the process to move forward without confrontation, which meant there was no argument to witness and no apology to wait for. I learned that absence could be a choice, and that choice could shape your life just as much as any decision spoken out loud. At school, Susan Miller checked in once and then did not again. She seemed relieved when I said I was staying with Jonathan and that everything was being handled. Adults like endings, even when they are not real endings. I let her have one. Jonathan did not try to make me feel better with reassurances. He did not tell me everything would be okay. He gave me structure instead. Dinner was at 6 unless there was a reason it could not be. Homework came before television. Money was discussed plainly. He told me what things cost and why we chose one option over another. It was the first time I saw money treated as something practical rather than emotional. Even with all of that, I did not feel like I belonged. I waited until Jonathan went to bed before opening the refrigerator at night. I ate quietly and quickly, even when there was more than enough. I did not invite friends over because the idea of explaining who Jonathan was and why I lived there felt too complicated. When teachers asked about my parents, I answered carefully and changed the subject. I watched my parents from a distance without trying to reach them. They appeared online in pictures from dinners and parties and trips that looked warm and loud and complete. My sisters smiled beside them. Everyone looked exactly the way a family is supposed to look. I searched the backgrounds of those photos for clues, for anything that suggested they remembered me. There was nothing. Jonathan noticed things without pointing them out. He did not comment when I avoided using the living room. He did not say anything when I left my clothes folded in my bag instead of putting them in the dresser. He simply made space and waited. The first time I broke something in the house, my body reacted before my mind did. It was a glass from the cabinet, nothing special, but the sound was sharp and final. I stood there staring at the pieces on the floor, already rehearsing my apology. I told him I was sorry and that I would pay for it. The words came out quickly, practiced. Jonathan looked at the glass and then at me. He said the house was not meant to be preserved like an exhibit. He told me to get the broom. That was it. No lecture, no disappointment. The moment passed and I stood there afterward feeling confused by how small it had been. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to understand why my chest felt tight. I realized I had been waiting for a consequence that never came. It was unsettling in a way I did not expect. When you grow up expecting punishment, kindness can feel like a trap. Time moved on anyway. By the second year, I knew the routines well enough to stop watching the clock. Jonathan drove me to school and asked about my classes. Sometimes I answered in detail, sometimes I said they were fine. He accepted both responses the same way. When I asked him questions, he answered honestly, even when the answer was that he did not know. He never spoke badly about my parents. That absence of judgment forced me to think for myself. It was easier when someone told you who to be angry at. Silence left room for complicated feelings, and I was not good at those yet. The legal arrangement became official enough that no one questioned where I lived anymore. Papers were signed, forms were filed. I learned that systems cared more about documentation than intention. As long as the right boxes were checked, the rest could remain unresolved. At home, I started using the dresser. Not all at once, one drawer at a time. I still kept my bag under the bed. I told myself it was practical. Jonathan continued to set rules, but they were always explained. He told me I did not need permission to eat or shower or use the washing machine. He said the house was there to be lived in. Hearing that did not immediately change how I behaved, but it planted something. The shame did not disappear, it shifted. I stopped feeling like a guest who might be asked to leave at any moment and started feeling like someone on probation. I tried to be useful. I cleaned without being asked. I finished my homework early. I kept my grades up. I did not cause trouble. I believed that if I could be good enough, I would earn my place. Jonathan never said I had to earn anything. The contrast between his house and the images of my family online grew sharper as the years went on. Holidays came and went. I spent them quietly with Jonathan or alone in my room, telling myself it was easier that way. My parents never reached out. My sisters never asked where I was. By the time I was 16, the house no longer felt borrowed, but it did not feel like mine either. It felt like a place I was allowed to exist as long as I stayed within invisible lines. I did not know who drew those lines. I assumed they were mine. One evening, after a long day at school, I came home to find Jonathan reviewing documents at the table. He looked up and asked if I had eaten. When I said not yet, he nodded and went back to reading. There was food in the kitchen. He did not offer to make it for me. He did not ask why I had not eaten. He trusted me to take care of myself. I made a sandwich and sat across from him. The silence was comfortable, which surprised me. I realized then that safety was not loud. It did not announce itself. It showed up in the way nothing bad happened when you made a small mistake. Time moved on anyway. As the years passed, that realization settled deeper. I still did not feel chosen, but I felt protected. By the time I finished high school, the idea of leaving that house scared me more than the idea of staying ever had. That fear told me something important, even if I was not ready to name it yet. I went to bed that night with my bag still under the bed, but untouched. I did not unpack it. I did not need to. The house was quiet, the rules were clear, and for the first time I could imagine a future that did not involve waiting for someone to come back.
Chapter 3. I learned to stand on my own before moving forward. College did not arrive as a clean beginning. It came slowly, layered over the life I had already built, and it carried a different kind of fear with it. I moved to Massachusetts in the fall of 2017 with 2 suitcases and a scholarship packet I had read so many times I knew the numbers by memory. The campus was public and practical, the kind of place where students hurried between buildings with coffee in their hands and headphones on. No one cared where I came from or who had dropped me off. That anonymity felt like freedom and responsibility at the same time. For the first time, my fear was no longer about taking up space. It was about choosing wrong. In high school, I had learned how to be careful. In college, being careful was not enough. Every decision seemed permanent. Every path felt like it closed 3 others behind it. I chose a program focused on infrastructure project management because it made sense. Roads, utilities, systems that had to work quietly in the background. There was comfort in that logic. Jonathan drove me to campus the first day. He helped carry my bags up the stairs and set them by the bed without comment. When he stood to leave, I waited for a speech or a warning. Instead, he said he would call on Sundays and that if I needed anything, I should ask. That was all. I learned quickly that no one was watching my choices anymore. I had to decide when to study and when to rest. I had to decide which jobs to apply for and which classes to take. The fear that followed me was sharp and focused. It asked what would happen if I failed without anyone to blame. I applied for campus jobs and took the first one I could get. It paid little, but it paid consistently. I learned to budget down to the dollar. Jonathan helped when I asked, but he never offered before I did. When I called him to talk through decisions, he asked questions instead of giving answers. "What do you think the cost of that choice is?" he would ask. Sometimes I hated that question. Sometimes it saved me. During my second year, I met Daniel Brooks in a planning seminar. He sat 2 rows behind me and spoke only when he had something to say. We started talking after class, first about assignments and then about everything else. He did not ask questions that felt invasive. He listened the way Jonathan did, without trying to fill the space. We studied together. We walked campus at night. We argued about urban design and budgets and how cities grew. When I told him about my family, he did not rush to judge them or comfort me. He asked how it affected the way I made decisions. It felt strange and grounding at the same time. Jonathan met Daniel once when he visited campus. The 2 of them spoke briefly while I watched from the side, unsure of my role in the interaction. Later, Jonathan asked if Daniel treated me like a partner or a project. I laughed and said, "A partner." "Good," he said. He did not say anything else. As graduation approached, my parents reached out. The messages were short and polite. "How are you? We heard you are graduating soon. We should get together." There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the years that had passed. The absence of that felt louder than any argument. I showed the messages to Daniel first. He read them and handed my phone back without comment. Then I showed them to Jonathan. He read them carefully and asked what I wanted to do. When I said I did not know, he nodded. "Not knowing is an answer too," he said. During that same semester, I was offered an internship that could have changed everything. The firm worked on large-scale infrastructure projects, and the position came with access and influence. The catch was small and easy to ignore. They expected flexibility with reporting, nothing illegal, just convenient omissions. It was the kind of thing people called practical. My supervisor explained it in a tone that assumed agreement. "This is how things move faster," he said. "You learn the system by bending it a little." I went home that night and did not sleep. The next morning, I called Jonathan. "I could get ahead," I said, "but it feels wrong." There was a pause on the line. "Then it is wrong for you," he said. "The question is whether you can live with the cost of saying no." I said no. The consequences were immediate and quiet. I finished the internship without the glowing recommendation I had expected. I heard later that I was described as rigid, not flexible, difficult to place. It stung more than I admitted. Linda Cooper entered my life around that time. She lived in the building next to mine and often sat on the shared steps in the evenings. She talked easily and listened carefully. Over time, she told me about her life. She had stayed in a marriage that wore her down because leaving felt selfish, because family was family, because starting over was frightening. She kept telling myself it was easier this way, she said one night. I forgot to ask, easier for who? Her words followed me. Graduation came in the spring of 2021. My parents sent a congratulatory message. They did not attend. Jonathan did. He sat in the crowd and clapped when my name was called. It was not a grand gesture. It was steady. Afterward, we ate lunch together. He asked what came next. "I have an offer in Boston," I said. "It is solid, not exciting." "Solid is a good place to stand," he replied. I took the job. Moving to Boston felt different from moving to college. This time, I chose it. The apartment was small. The work was demanding. I learned how to manage projects and people and deadlines. I learned how to say no without apologizing. Daniel moved with me. We built a life that did not require rescue. Jonathan visited when he could. He asked about my work and listened to the answers. My parents continued to send occasional messages. I responded when it felt right and ignored them when it did not. Standing in my apartment one evening, looking over the city, I realized something had shifted again. The fear that followed me was still there, but it no longer ran the show. I had chosen carefully and lived with the consequences. I had stood by my decisions even when they cost me something. For the first time, the future felt like something I was shaping rather than waiting for. I did not call it belonging yet, but I trusted my footing enough to keep moving forward.
Chapter 4.
The people who returned when I no longer needed them. Stability has a way of revealing what you thought you had already outrun. By 2022, my life in Boston had settled into something steady. My workdays were full but predictable. Projects moved from planning to execution without drama. I knew the rhythm of my weeks and the sound of my own apartment at night. Daniel and I shared a life that felt chosen rather than assembled out of necessity. I believed I had learned how to move forward without looking back. That was when my parents began to reappear. It started with messages that sounded thoughtful and restrained. They asked how I was doing. They said they missed me. They talked about family as if it were a shared memory rather than an unresolved absence. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the years that had passed. The words were careful and soft, wrapped in a tone that suggested concern while leaving space for obligation. My sisters followed. Marissa sent a message congratulating me on a promotion she had learned about online. Claire asked if I was planning to visit home anytime soon. They spoke as if nothing fundamental had been broken, as if time had smoothed everything over on its own. I did not respond right away. I read the messages and set the phone down. I felt the familiar pull between wanting closure and wanting distance. Forgiveness sounded noble. Self-protection felt practical. I was not sure which one would cost me more. Daniel noticed before I said anything. "You have been quieter," he said one evening as we cooked dinner. I told him about the messages. He listened without interrupting. "What do you want from them?" he asked when I finished. I did not have an answer. That felt like an answer, too. Around the same time, Jonathan began to slow down. He never complained, he just took longer to stand up from a chair. He forgot things he had never forgotten before. When I asked how he was feeling, he said, "Fine," in a way that suggested the word meant something different now. He insisted it was nothing and changed the subject. I visited more often. On one of those visits, I noticed paperwork spread neatly across his dining table, documents I did not recognize. He saw me looking and smiled faintly. "Just organizing," he said. I knew better than to push. Later, I learned that Michael Reyes had been coming by to help. Jonathan did not announce it. He handled things the way he always had, quietly, thoroughly, without inviting anyone else into the process. My parents pushed harder. They asked to meet for coffee. They said it would be good to talk. They spoke about healing and moving forward as if those were shared goals rather than personal requests. The condition was always implied. Family deserved access. Family deserved another chance. I asked Daniel what he thought. He said, "I think they are asking you to carry the weight they put down years ago. You do not have to pick it up." Jonathan did not tell me what to do. When I asked his opinion, he asked me what boundaries would let me sleep at night. He reminded me that forgiveness did not require proximity. The hospital visit happened quickly. Jonathan called one afternoon and told me not to worry. That was how I knew something was wrong. I took the first train and sat beside his bed while machines hummed quietly in the background. He looked smaller than I remembered, but his eyes were clear. "I did not save you," he said suddenly, as if continuing a conversation we had not started. "I just stood in the way." I told him he had done more than that. He shook his head. "You did the growing," he said. "I just made sure no one knocked you down while you did." The conversation stayed with me long after he was discharged. It felt like a closing of something that had begun years earlier without either of us naming it. He passed away a few months later. There was no dramatic lead-up, no long goodbye.
I received the call in the middle of a workday and felt the floor tilt beneath me. Daniel met me outside my office and held me while I cried in a way that felt both raw and contained. Grief did not explode, it settled. The funeral was small and orderly, just as he would have wanted. Friends and colleagues spoke about his work and his integrity. I listened from the front row and tried to absorb the finality of it. My family arrived together. They dressed carefully and spoke softly. They hugged me briefly and told me how sorry they were for my loss. They looked around the room as if taking inventory. Their grief felt measured, appropriate, contained within lines they had learned to observe. During the reception, they asked questions. How long had I been in Boston? How was my job? What would happen with Jonathan's house? Who was handling his affairs? The questions came wrapped in concern, but pointed in a familiar direction. Michael Reyes found me near the end of the evening. "We'll schedule a time to go over everything," he said quietly. Jonathan was very clear. I nodded without asking what that meant. When the funeral ended and everyone left, I stood alone in Jonathan's house. The silence felt heavier than it had ever felt before. This time, it did not feel borrowed. It felt final. That night, I sat at the kitchen table where he had once spread out documents and realized the past was no longer something I could postpone dealing with. The choices ahead were not about memory or forgiveness. They were about access. My family called again the next day. They spoke about support and togetherness. They said we should stay close now. They mentioned how important it was to honor Jonathan's legacy. The implication was clear. They believed they were next in line. I listened and did not correct them. When I hung up, Daniel asked if I was okay. "I'm not sure yet," I said, "but I know what I'm not willing to do." That clarity surprised me. It did not feel angry, it felt grounded. The days that followed were filled with practical tasks, meetings with Michael, sorting through papers, making decisions that Jonathan had prepared me for without ever saying so out loud. I saw his hand in everything, his preference for clarity, his refusal to dramatize. My parents continued to circle closer. They asked when we would talk about the future. They spoke as if it were a shared plan waiting to be finalized. Each conversation sharpened the line I had drawn inside myself. Standing in the empty house one evening, I understood something I had avoided naming for years. The boundaries ahead were not about the past anymore. They were about the present and the life I had built with intention. Whatever came next would require me to stand still rather than step aside. For the first time, I did not feel the need to justify that to anyone.
Chapter 5. Justice was quiet, but it did not turn back. The meeting was scheduled for a quiet morning, the kind that makes every sound feel deliberate. I arrived early and sat in the conference room with my hands folded in my lap. The table was polished and bare. Light came through the windows without drama. Nothing about the setting suggested confrontation, and that felt intentional. Jonathan had always believed clarity did not need decoration. My family arrived together. They took seats across from me and spoke in low voices. There were polite nods and careful expressions. No one raised their voice. No one asked how I was sleeping. Their eyes moved around the room as if measuring what might belong to them by the end of the hour. Michael Reyes entered with a folder and a calm expression. He greeted everyone and explained the process in a neutral tone. There were no speeches about legacy or love, just procedures, just facts. As he read through the document, I felt myself settle instead of tense. I realized then that I was not waiting for a verdict. I was listening to a confirmation. Jonathan had not left instructions for punishment.
There were no clauses designed to humiliate or retaliate. He had simply made choices, clear ones. He had decided who would be responsible for what came next. Everything flowed to me: the house, the accounts, the authority to decide how things would be handled. Michael explained it carefully and without emphasis. It was not a reward, it was a responsibility. The room went quiet. My parents exchanged looks that flickered between confusion and disbelief. One of my sisters leaned forward as if she had misheard something fundamental. Someone asked a question about fairness. Another mentioned family. The words came out controlled but sharp around the edges. Michael responded with the same calm he had used throughout. The document was clear. The choices were final. There was nothing to contest. I watched their faces change in real time. Shock gave way to denial. Denial shifted into a restrained anger that had nowhere to land. There were no accusations to hurl and no leverage to pull. Jonathan had removed the argument by refusing to create one. They turned to me then. I did not explain. I did not justify. I did not recount the past or list grievances. I stated what would happen next and what would not. I spoke slowly and evenly. I told them the past could not be rewritten and the present would not be opened for negotiation. There was a moment where I expected to feel something sharp: satisfaction, vindication, rage. None of it arrived. What I felt instead was quiet. The meeting ended the way it began. Chairs moved, papers were gathered, polite goodbyes were exchanged. My family left together, their voices hushed as they stepped into the hallway. They did not look back. I stayed behind for a moment. Michael asked if I was all right, and I told him I was. It surprised me how true that felt. He nodded and said Jonathan had planned carefully. He said he hoped that brought some peace. It did. When I stepped outside, the air felt different, lighter. Not because something had been taken away from others, but because something had been returned to me: control, choice, the right to decide who had access to my life. I drove back to the house alone. Jonathan's house no longer felt like a place I was keeping for him. It felt like a place I was responsible for. I walked through the rooms slowly. I noticed things I had never allowed myself to claim before: the chair by the window, the worn edge of the kitchen table, the quiet consistency of it all. I sat down and let the silence surround me. This time it did not feel heavy, it felt earned. My phone buzzed later that evening, a message from my mother asking if we could talk. I read it and set the phone down. I did not feel the urge to respond immediately. I did not feel the need to explain my silence. Daniel came home and asked how it went. I told him it was finished. He nodded and did not ask for details. We made dinner together and talked about ordinary things: work, plans for the weekend, the kind of life that continues whether or not old wounds reopen. That night, I slept without rehearsing conversations in my head. I slept without bracing for impact. In the days that followed, my family reached out again. The messages grew shorter, the tone shifted. There was frustration there, and then something close to resignation. Eventually, the messages stopped. No one forced them to leave. They simply ran out of doors. I did not block their numbers. I did not make a show of cutting ties. I allowed the silence to stand on its own. It felt more honest that way. Karma, I learned, does not always arrive as punishment. Sometimes it arrives as the absence of access. Sometimes it is nothing more dramatic than being left outside the life you once walked away from. I spent more time in the house. I fixed things that needed fixing. I made changes Jonathan would have approved of, and some he probably would not have noticed. I invited people over. I laughed in rooms where I had once whispered. For the first time, the idea of belonging did not feel conditional. I belonged to my choices. I belonged to the life I had built with intention. I belonged to myself. Looking back, I understand that Jonathan never tried to replace my family. He never asked me to choose between loyalty and truth. He simply made space for me to grow without interference. In the end, that was the greatest gift he could have given me. There was no moment of triumph, no victory speech, just a steady sense of alignment. If there's anything I hope stays with those who hear this story, it is this: you do not owe access to people who left when you needed them most. You do not need to punish anyone to move forward. Sometimes the quiet decision to close a door is enough to change everything. If this story resonated with you, if you recognized any part of yourself in it, you are not alone. Sometimes justice is not loud. Sometimes it simply refuses to turn back.